Nice. Thanks, Phoebe, Carol. Hi, everybody. I think there's some faces I can recognise, but for context, I now can't see you all because I'm looking at my notes on the screen. But thank you so much for having us and joining us today. You've got myself and my colleague Ricardo. Don't know if you want to say a quick hey.
Hello, hello.
Um, Actually, originally, so we're the step-in team today. Originally, it was going to be all three of our colleagues who are trained young people's violence advisors, which is amazing that we now have three, and we're going to say more about that in a minute. One's had a car crash and has whiplash. The other's been called to jury service, and the third one's sick. So we're having had three, we're three down. But that said, you've got Ricardo and I today, and just for a little bit of context. I was actually involved in setting up Art Against Knives, gosh, 15 years ago, and together Ricardo and I have run it and been around since day one. So whilst you haven't got our three yippers, you do have two people who know and can tell this story and talk to the work really well. So yeah, thanks for bearing with us as we step in today. We thought we might do about 30 minutes and then pause because actually I think having done this before, what feels like the most helpful and effective way of doing this is be able to have conversation. So you might hear us talk about things to begin with, and please like take a note and then we can deep dive into any of it as we finish. What feels really important to us and like is a really like core part of like our mission at Art Against Knives at the moment is when we're sharing, we're really supporting other people and understanding like the how to bit, like what does this look like in practice and how do you take these kind of slightly larger ideas or kind of I suppose like more thematic stuff that we hear people talk about, but like we're interested in the like, well, how do you apply that and what does that look like when you're working with young people? So we're going to try and like toe that line as we go through the presentation, but if you've got questions about the practicalities, we're really here for that as well. Cool. So I'm gonna dive in, and maybe just say a little something about Art Against Knives first. Phoebe, if you don't mind, like flicking us through the first slides, just a little intro. So we've been a registered charity for 15 years. Our mission really is to make it possible for all young people to create their own positive futures, like free from violence and harm. Um, that's what we're here to do. When we talk about violence, we're not just talking about youth violence, we're talking about young people and their experience of violence, abuse, exploitation, and harm. That's not just like peer on peer or their own behaviours. We take a really contextual approach to look at, young people's experiences of harms and the kind of why behind what's going on from them. So that could be anything from, kind of experience of racialized young people within the context of education through to contact with criminal justice system and quite often like systemic harm that young people face as well. Could probably do a whole hour just talking about that. But I won't. But for I just wanted to like hold that as a like if you zoom out, we're looking at the young person, their community that they're in, and then the context and the systems around them and then the harm that they're experiencing within that and the ways in which we can strengthen that system and that network to make sure that they are safer and able to create their own positive futures. Maybe a little something about how we do that then, so we can flick through slightly here, Phoebe. So our entire model since we started as an organisation was all about putting young people in the lead. It's not, we don't have the answers, we don't know. And for 15 years, we've been inviting young people to co-design their own spaces, creative spaces within the context of their community. So that is everything from nail and hair bars for young women, non-binary and trans young people, which we'll say more about in a minute, through to actually the lab, which is our music studio, which is here, thanks to the support of youth music, who have been supporting us for an incredibly long time. And you may or may not have just seen, but the labs celebrates its 10th birthday this year, and we've literally just won the Social Justice Award from Youth Music. So just a really amazing moment to have that space and that work, which has been, designed and run by young people and the team Art Against Knives for a decade now. So that's our model, but within those spaces, we embed support so that we can like bring that to young people, both in a space and at a pace that works best for them. So that looks like our music producers are mental health specialists, serious youth violence specialists. We have nail and hair technicians who are young people's violence advisors. Again, more on that in a minute. But essentially, through the creative process and through that activity, young people are able to access both early intervention and prevention support as well as crisis support. So we're basically ready to move and do that work at any given moment. So that is essentially our model. If we just move forward to the next slide, if we can. Perfect. So today, we're going to talk specifically about how, within the context of our model and our work, which is community-based, do we work to reduce and prevent gender-based violence? So for context, so you can place this work, our work is really like rooted in the community. So predominantly well, in fact, nearly all of our work is in Barnet in North London. It is London's second largest borough. We've been in the borough for 14 years, and we are supporting at any given time about 450 to 500 of what we call the borough's most socially excluded young people. So that's for context how we're working, and then the click down from that is that majority of the young people that we support like access on a consistent and regular basis, all because of choice. But at any given time, we're holding probably a cohort of about 250 young people and doing this work with them. So I always think it's quite helpful to place that, so when I'm talking about this work, you can see where we are and what that looks like in terms of scale. Um, cool. So let's just move through a little bit here to the next slide. Cool. So I've touched on this a little bit in terms of how we work, but when we talk about gender-based violence, I think obviously like we know we can sit here again and do a whole another hour on like what that is and what that means. But actually, I think when we're thinking about it, we thought the most helpful thing was to pull out what that looks like for the young people that we work with and we support at Art Against Knives. So we can flick through again, Phoebe. So, in the UK, gender-based violence refers to violence that disproportionately affects women and girls and those within the LGBTQ plus community. And also within that, it includes a range of abuse. So sexual violence, domestic abuse, stalking, forced marriages. But what we do know is that gender-based violence is rooted in a inequality, and it is most commonly perpetrated by men against women. But it can also be directed at anyone who does not conform to gender norms. So this is it's a huge thing. It's a huge subject. It's really complex, and the ways in which it presents and shows up is also, I suppose, like not always understood. Language around gender-based violence has shifted as it should and as it needed to, but quite dramatically over the past kind of 5 to 10 years. Originally, actually, when we started at Art Against Knives, we had a standalone domestic abuse policy, and we have now kind of done that, and we now have a gender-based violence policy and approach that looks at all of this. I suppose one of the things that's really important for us to also say is like a lot of our knowledge is being based on learning and the experiences of young people and what we've tried and tested in practice. But we are always learning. And we see ourselves as a learning organisation. So what we're sharing is stuff that we've seen that works and stuff that young people have told us they need. But just acknowledging that, we're by no means the expert in gender-based violence, and we continue to learn from practice, but also from others around us. And there is some really, really incredible work going on in this space, which we draw on, but can also say more about towards the end. Cool. So what does it look like for young people? Like statistics are really, really, really scary. Like we know, I think there's like 3.9 million people aged 16 and over in England and Wales who are estimated to have experienced some kind of domestic abuse in the last year. 3.9 million. people, we know that young people aged 16 to 24 were the highest percentage of victims of domestic abuse in the same year. Yet we are still, only just really like talking about how we do this work from like an early intervention and prevention approach. What else have we got here? So women aged 16 are likely, 16 to 19 are way more likely to be victims than women aged 25 and over. Similarly, though, in that context, men aged 16 to 19 are most likely to experience domestic abuse than any other age. And 78% of children living with domestic abuse are directly harmed by the perpetrator of abuse, as well as obviously being witnesses to abuse as well. So this is often really complex when young people, become victims, but also are witnessing abuse within the home. So maybe another point on language, and my colleague Cristala, who is going to present today, is really amazing at doing this. But we've been thinking a lot about our language and how we use this language and talk to young people. We've been thinking with young people about the language we use. So we tend to say, like when we're talking to young people, we're talking about young people who are at risk of being harmed or have been harmed. And we also talk about young people who have harmed, or we're concerned about their harmful behaviour. So that's how we tend to talk to young people about this. Internally, though, when we're talking, we may refer to victim and perpetrator in an internal context. Often it's like an easier way of being able to talk about that dynamic. But just in terms of external language to young people, that seems to be what's landing for us. So I'm gonna maybe flip a little bit today. Cool. So let's go to like our five kind of whistle stop tour of our five headlines of what we do to address gender-based violence within the context of our work. So imagine you're in our creative spaces. Let's go to point one, which is that we take a really intersectional approach to this work. So obviously, we know that young people's experiences of violence and discrimination are shaped not only by their gender, but also by age, race, faith, culture, and lots of other social identities. But also the importance of recognizing that these factors intersect. So obviously for each young person, they overlap and they influence one another, meaning that these barriers or these experiences are completely unique for each individual. So what feels really important when we're talking about like a blanket approach to gender-based violence, that we never lose the fact that when we meet each individual, we're understanding what that means for them in their own context. So that's a really important starting point, because some of the stuff that we're going to go on and talk about through this presentation feels quite like, okay, this is what we do for everybody. But our starting point is understanding what's going on for that young person. What is their identity? What is their experience? And how are we tailoring our support offer to address their individual needs? To give you some examples of sort of like how we do that, it often includes thinking about age. We'll think a lot about their faith and their culture, their racial identity, and gender. And that will help us think about which space we're bringing them into. So, what is a safe space for them within our kind of like, I suppose, like fleet of spaces that we have running? What is going to be the safest one for them because of all of those factors? And then we also think about our staff and who they may need and who's going to be best placed to be able to support them because of this. Now, often we're able to do that because of the kind of, I suppose, the kind of beauty of our like very like diverse interdisciplinary team. But the reality is also we can't. So if we can't bring the perfect person in to work with this young person, still, what are we doing? How are we holding that context and doing that work and really thinking about what we know, but also what we don't know about each young person? Cool. So these are the sorry, these are my slides. This is intersectional approach. So we start by understanding each individual young person. Can we flip to the next? page. Perfect. We're going to share these slides because there's quite a lot of detail, and my colleague Cristala's popped a lot in here, which I think it will be really useful resources for everybody. But I'll just keep this one moving, Phoebe, if that's okay, because I've touched on a lot of that. Great, we can keep going. Cool. So that's our starting ground. And then let's go to number two. So I mentioned earlier that we have three YIPFers on our team. So YIPFers are actually, if you don't know already, independent and young persons domestic abuse advisors. These are actually trained team members. So this is a qualification that takes about a year to complete. We offer it to our team, or we have offered it to people on our team, and they do it like on the job. So they're able to be like in like practicing it, and then they're supported with the covering the cost of the qualification and also time to be able to put that into practice. What's unusual though about how we work and this role and this fit within the context of our community work is typically, and many of you may know this in your work or have like worked with IDFAs before, because IDFAs typically sit within the context of social care or like statutory services, and they nearly always work at kind of point of crisis. So an IDFA is for kind of adults and a YIPFA is a young person's version of that. So you would see them sitting within like statutory care, for, like Solace Women's Aid, whoever your local provider is. Sometimes they sit in house within social care. Often they sit in housing as well. But it is really quite unusual for them to be embedded within a community organisation in the way that we have. And we've actually been doing this since 2018 because we first set up safe spaces for young women and girls in 2012 in the form of these nail and hair bars. And one of the things that we noticed really quickly, and perhaps really honestly, quite naively, is what does happen when you create safe spaces for really vulnerable young women and girls is that you're building trust with them, and obviously they're going to disclose information. But I don't think that the pace of those disclosures and the depth of them we had quite realised would come, and we ended up having this kind of really big wave of really, really, really serious disclosures in relation to gender-based violence. And our model originally at the time was, we're not here to do everything. We're here to connect young people with services and support that already exists in their community and help them navigate that. But for young women in Barnet, and one particular estate in North Barnet called Doddes Valley Estate, actually the reality for these young women is they had to turn up at a police station in Colindale, which is west of the borough with no transport links, independently and say that they were a victim of domestic abuse in order to be able to access support. And obviously, we also know statistically that it takes, young women and girls up to 5 times, to realize or kind of talk about what's going on for them before they feel able to actually go and make that disclosure and access help. So it's really critical moments. And then asking a young person to be able to take this huge trek and turn up and do that is completely unrealistic. So it's at this point that we realised that we needed to make sure we had the expertise embedded in our team so that we were ready and able to respond at that moment in which they felt safe enough and able to talk to us about it. So that is why we then decided to train and ensure that we have this expert knowledge within our team. Gosh, I've lost track. 2018 is 7 years now. So we've been testing and piloting this way of working for that length of time. And I would now say I just can't imagine us not having these roles and these posts now, or at least this level of knowledge and expertise on our team, because we still continue to see this volume of disclosures coming through. So the other, let's talk a little bit about this role, I suppose. So what does it look like in practice? So Actually, typically, the from an early intervention and prevention perspective, in fact, I think we can slip through to the next slide, Phoebe. But what does it look like? So, for young people for whom perhaps like, they haven't been harmed, but there may be like they could be, I suppose, like at risk of unhealthy relationships or various things like online safety. We do a lot of work with them within the context of our creative spaces. So this looks like conversations around healthy or unhealthy relationships. So that could be everything from like peer-to-peer relationships, but actually something that we're seeing increasingly at the moment is the importance of understanding like age-appropriate relationships, understanding power and control, and how that shows up in their life and how that manifests and how that leads to various things. Um, the risk of digital and online abuse, cultural and identity factors in relation to abuse, and then a lot of work around things like reframing masculinities and understanding misogyny, which is done cross gender, um, but really critical to understanding, these behaviours and thinking about change and recognising individual behaviours and roles and responsibilities within the context of abuse, but from a much younger age. So that's the work that will happen from more of an early intervention and prevention perspective. But then, as I mentioned before, we're also dealing with young people who do turn up in crisis, or actually, most commonly, would talk about experiences, whether historic or recent, without actually realizing the severity of harm or the abuse that they've experienced. So, in those moments, our team are able to respond with everything from being able to do risk assessments. Sometimes it's necessary to then support them with court and protection orders. They do both immediate and long-term safety planning with young people. So that's thinking about their immediate context and making changes, and ensuring that longer-term safety planning is happening as well. There's a lot of advocacy and like service coordination. So because obviously they're young people, there's a lot of different people that need to be involved, and also, child protection processes and safeguarding processes kick in, as they would normally. So there's all of that to navigate. Often we end up also doing referrals to other specialist services in relation to things like housing and substance abuse, when we're looking at kind of like a holistic long-term support model. And this bit's quite critical, but a lot of guidance around legal advice and navigating the legal system, and in some instances helping access legal aid. But also we run all of this in line with a therapeutic support offer. So how are we holding that young person? How are we giving them a space to be able to think through and be supported through their experiences, and ultimately to be able to heal from the harm that they've experienced? So a lot of practicalities, but also this ongoing like therapeutic support and consistent support through like ongoing relationships within our safe spaces. Um, Again, like there is a lot to be able to unpick within the context of that role. But I think the most important thing to understand is there's this early intervention and prevention role, but then there's also an ability to be able to respond at point of crisis and manage risk. Cool. So we can flick through. Um, let's keep going. Here's some examples of our work. Again, we'll share these slides because it's really nice for you to see. This is actually a picture that's been done recently with a young person when they were just thinking about themselves and their identity and really helping them understand themselves, which is an example of some of the therapeutic work that goes on. Thanks, Phoebe. We can keep going, keep going. Here's two of our team, or that's Sophie actually and Indica, one of our peer leaders. It is a real shame that they're not here to share this with you themselves today, but there they are in action. Let's keep going. Cool. So then the next part of our model and support is what we call knowledge exchange. So actually, how are we making sure that all young people have access to equal access, to knowledge in relation to gender-based violence? One of the biggest things that we see is, we'll be taught is this, I suppose, a sense of normality around a lot of this, but also Young people tell us all this all the time. We actually don't even understand what that means. Like gender-based violence in itself as a term feels really overwhelming, and we don't really understand what that means. So a really critical part of this work is helping young people, understand this, but also be able to understand it from the context of different lived experiences and learnings. And so this is why we call this process knowledge exchange rather than, I suppose, like education. It's how can we learn from each other and hear about people's experiences, and it feel like an opportunity to learn from each other, rather than this kind of like top down, you know, here's a lesson on gender-based violence. So what does this look like in practice? We can skip to the next page, Phoebe. So we do a lot of work, including things like awareness raising, using posters, visual materials, youth-led content, creative workshops. So we use a lot of creative tools to be able to deliver informal and collective learning, and do a lot of work to make sure this is like age and culturally appropriate. That's the beauty of being able to design creative workshops and really think about how we're tailoring that to young people's needs. We do a lot of co-creating resources with young people. So ensuring that the stuff that we're using, that is then obviously engaging and accessible and inclusive to others. We also employ and train peer leaders. So Indica, who was in that previous photo, is an example of a young person who's come through our spaces, who's now employed. So actually, she's also responsible for transferring her learning to peers, and has like a kind of more formal paid role within the context of our spaces, but then is obviously able to go and do that, and bring that knowledge into the community, into her own life, and to her peers in that way. A little example actually is of the work that we also do around sexual health. Supporting young people's, I suppose, overall health and well-being is really critical to addressing gender-based violence. So we actually run sessions around this, around sexual health, but we also actually deliver the C card scheme, which is condom education and distribution scheme, within all of our spaces as well. And it's a really useful way of being able to engage in these conversations, and do this kind of ongoing rather than just a distribution, for example. Condoms, again, I feel that's a whole other session on how you do this. But one thing I would say at this moment is like being really careful to make sure you've got a really, really, really clear, I suppose, policy or set of guidance within your organisation about how you distribute that in relation to young people's faith and the different types of relationships. So, Brooke, actually, if you don't know, her national charity are absolutely amazing on training and advice around how to deliver sexual health advice, and the C card scheme actually. So I'd really recommend going to them if you're looking uh, to, to, I suppose, like strengthen how you do that work or add it to your provision. Cool. Let's keep going. Um, we also, I suppose this is an example actually of a recent workshop that's coming up. So we do advertise and do, quite specific workshops within the context of our spaces. I would say this has been quite a big shift actually in our practice, which is we used to do this work quite silently. It'd be like, come and paint nails, and they wouldn't necessarily know that we'd be bringing things into conversation. And I think that's still really effective. But we're now getting really, I suppose, intentional about naming some of the workshops and the activities that we do in relation to gender-based violence, with young people. So this is all co-designed. But it feels like a really important shift that young people can see and know that we're doing this work, and also have the opportunity to kind of sign up to it as well. So this one is called Unpack the Cycle. Um, the team do some really amazing work throughout this workshop, but it's everything from being able to name the impact of abuse. So whether that's like emotional, physical, or the psychological effects of this. They do this amazing exercise where they redesign the power control wheel, which is a typical tool that's used in this work, and create their own healthy relationship version. So showing up, and thinking about harmful, risky, and healthy behaviours when it comes to relationships. Learning a lot about where to access support and what they would do. And also like what we call reframing safety. So like how do they redefine what unsafe means? Recognize the harm that they experience, and really think about then what would need to be in place for the context of them and their peers and their community in order to feel safe. Um, so that is an example of that work in practice. Let's keep going. I'm really conscious of time. Here's some more of this beautiful work. We can keep going. Thank you, Phoebe. Cool. So I'm just going to touch on this quickly, but this is another really critical part of how we work, which is, I suppose the typical pattern is that a young person would come through the knowledge exchange. So they'd be learning about gender-based violence, and or they would have perhaps had an experience, but they've been supported in moving through this and are at a good place. And before we'd start saying to young people, what's your experience of harm and what do you want to change about it, there really is a process there. But I suppose typically young people who are perhaps a little bit older, so 17 to 25, at Art Against Knives, we'd want to give them an opportunity to really be able to draw on their experiences and think about how they want to go on and change something in the context of their community. So we do that in many ways, but I suppose the most popular ones are a podcast, producing magazines, and or I suppose like pop-up events or spaces in which they basically get to go out to the community, share, headlines of their experiences, naming the change that they want to happen and also the solutions and a real call to action, whether that's teachers in a school or I don't know, care workers within social care, or it could just be members of the public. How would they want people around them to behave or act differently or change in order to prevent gender-based violence and to be able to support young people? So we can whiz through this bit as well, Phoebe, but something that we can, I think, is linked to this, but also we can share with you is some examples of those podcasts and the zines. In fact, some of the zines can be found on Art Against Knives website. We actually sell them now as part of our shop, and all proceeds go back to supporting our work. So there's a real sense of young people like being able to kind of, I suppose, like see their work go on and have that impact and be accessed by the wider public. And then the final bit to mention is our work in relation to systems change. So I mentioned this a little bit at the start in terms of Art Against Knives approach, but it's all very well, being able to talk to young people about how to stay safe, and how to, be able to heal from harm and their experience of it. But it's also really essential that we're making sure that we're working with the systems and the community around them to make sure that we're all doing everything that we need to be doing to ensuring that young people are safe. We actually have expanded this part of our work so much over the past 12 months that Kristala, who was going to be here to present, has actually come through as a kind of project manager for our nail and hair bars into a dedicated role. So she's now our gender-based violence lead within our organisation and basically sits between our practice, policy, and then like the systems change work to be able to make sure that she's collating the insights. So, what are we learning and hearing from young people about their experiences of gender-based violence? What are they saying are the most effective ways of supporting them? So, what are the themes and the thematic stuff that we're learning out of our spaces and projects? What do we need to then do to adapt and shift our own practice? How are we constantly learning and adapting and making sure that we're doing things differently? And then how are we taking that learning and then asking that of others around us as well? And often that looks like work within the context of a school, but Kristala also sits on our local Vorg forum. So takes this straight into kind of like strategy and decision making within the local authority. And she also sits on some national kind of panels on that network that does the same thing. So it's really important to us that we're making sure that what young people need, their ideas for change and their experiences are feeding into change around them. One of the biggest shifts that we've made as well as part of this work over the past kind of 12 months really is the work that we do across gender. So we our gender split is roughly uh 40% women and young girls, 40% um men, and then we have this kind of like 20% of either like non-binary or trans or gender non-conforming young people, or the I'm not sure, I don't want to know, I'm not ready to say space. But I wanted to share a couple of bits of learning that have been really critical to our practice over the past 12 to 18 months. Firstly, we got really intentional about gender and how we're creating safe spaces for all young people. We actually did, I think it was 6 to 9 months worth of work around this, where we held internal learning spaces and we really thought and were critical of ourselves and our own understanding and knowledge about what we'd need to do to make sure we were setting up safe spaces for everybody. And as a result of that work, our spaces for young women and girls became spaces for young women, girls, non-binary and trans young people. We were actively promoted that. What we've seen as a result is a significant increase in young people who turn up and who are either exploring their gender identity and sexuality, or and I feel safe enough to be able to name that. And young people are actively telling us that what feels so important to them is that they don't want to have to go to a space that's like specifically for them. They want to be included in like more broader, wider community spaces where they feel safe enough to explore themselves, and not, have to go over here because they are something, even when they're not sure what that is at the moment. And it's been some really interesting ongoing learning for us. But ultimately, what is a safe space when they don't exist? And what are we doing to make sure we're setting that up and playing a role in that? And then the other bit is actually our work with young men specifically. And really, honestly, I think when we set out to do this work about 15 years ago, I think really the onus was on, how are we supporting young women and girls in relation to domestic abuse. And whilst we've always done loads of work with young men, I don't think our work has been intentional enough or structured enough. And it definitely hasn't been strong enough in terms of an early intervention and prevention approach. And so we are now really driving that on a very different scale, doing loads of work, as I mentioned before, about exploring masculinity, misogyny, and have also like integrated our teams. So we now have kind of mixed teams with YITFAs on the teams. We have different genders, etc., across the board doing this work, and really like kind of, it used to feel like it was being delivered quite separate, but now we're one team delivering across everything. And this is a little case study actually that Kristala would have done a really beautiful job of bringing to life, because she delivers this. But a click down from all of this is also how are we creating safe spaces for like racialized young people, and specifically at Art Against Knives, about 89% at the moment. That does change, of young people we support are racialized young people, and we were seeing a massive increase in predominantly Black and mixed heritage girls and young women talking about experiences of care within the system, and ways in which they've been failed and didn't feel like they were able to access or safe enough to talk about it. So we set up a dedicated space just for them, which they co-designed and called it Her Story. We're actually in its second iteration of running this, and it is a weekly therapeutic space, in which they're supported through a really kind of clear journey, which they're learning, they're hearing from each other, they're supporting each other, and then they also are creating a podcast as a result of that work. And we're seeing a massive increase in people around us coming to us and asking about how they can start thinking about supporting young Black women and mixed heritage women, for example, in relation to gender-based violence, beyond this kind of like, universal approach to delivering this work. So this feels like a really critical click down as we're starting to design our provision, and really thinking about how we're, going back to that starting point of who is it that we're supporting, what are their identities, what are their experiences, and how are we tailoring what we're offering. to make sure we're able to access and support them. So that's definitely enough talking from me. I'm gonna stop and maybe go to the floor for questions, but also if I've missed something or you want to know more about anything, please say.
Did you want me to play the video?
Oh, yes.
I can try. Let's see if the sound works.
Hey, thank you. So this is I'm hot off the press. It's our first little edit coming out of the Her Story project.
We are daughters, sisters, mothers, storytellers, holding joy, pain, culture, and power all at once. In a world that often asks us to shrink, we created a space where we expand. Anything from as small as our hair to the roots of our trauma. A grassroots circle of care built by and for young Black and Black mixed heritage women. We come together not to fix each other, but to feel, to be seen, to talk about trauma, mental health, identity, relationships, and everything we're taught to hold in silence. Because young Black women are too often expected to be strong, even when we are breaking. Because therapy isn't always accessible or made for us. This space matters because it's ours.
That's cool, I like it. The growth, the light, the pain, the fight. We love, we fight, we hurt, we cry. We paid the price.
Through her story, we heal in community, not isolation. Guided by care, not judgment. Led by lived experience, not just textbooks. And through our podcast, we turn our truths into conversations, our healing into ripples that reach beyond the room, to enact change within the systems that often fail us. We are building more than a support group. We are nurturing a movement of softness, strength, and self-definition. This is who we are, and you're not alone.
There we go. Sorry, that was a lot of information to digest, everybody, but I don't know if anyone sat with any questions or thoughts.
I've got one that I can kick us off with. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. What an insight. And I think it just really speaks to like the complexity of a lot of the work that youth music funded organizations and non-youth music funded organizations are kind of doing out there in the community. Just in terms, and sorry if I missed this when you were talking, the kind of therapeutic spaces, like how are they, are you kind of using sort of like trained therapists within those, or is it people that have been trained up around trauma informed stuff, or how does that kind of look?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, I feel like another session around like mental health and therapeutic support, like coming out of it. So we've been on a really big journey around this as well. And we've actually spent, I think, the last 7 years working with an organisation, another charity called MAC UK, you may or may not have heard of. But they kind of pioneered this idea of taking therapy to the streets, I suppose, like out of the context of typical clinical settings. But part of the journey that we've been on with them, and majority of their team, for context, by the way, are often they're community psychologists, so they're trained psychologists, um, is to help us understand the work that we're already doing that is therapeutic. So I think, when we were starting this out, it's like, oh gosh, we've got to have, psychologists on our team delivering this support. And actually we're sat here 7 years later being like, no, this is the support. This is the therapeutic support that young people need and want. And this is actually what we are already doing. So I think always helpful to make sure we are a trauma-informed organisation. We make sure our spaces are psychologically informed. So, making sure our team are aware of that, doing baseline training around it, but also just recognising and stepping into your own power that the effective support and mental health support for young people is co-production. It's shifting power to them. It's all the stuff that I've talked about in this model of way of working. And I think a confidence in how you all work and will be working in being able to create appropriate therapeutic support and spaces for young people is a really important starting point. Yeah.
Hi. Yes, it was a lot of information, but like you mentioned, the therapeutic through working with the young people, it's to express themselves through music, and that's how we get them to recognize what they're dealing with and how they can express themselves. It's still we are in the beginning, but we can see it's a journey that they need to take.
This is it. And I think one of the most important things that I'll say to you all, because it's been like a journey for us to recognize, is you are already doing this. So you are best placed. You are doing all of this. I think the bit that feels important is the like, cool, do you have what you need to be able to respond to that? So if you're setting up these spaces of safety, if you're encouraging creative expression, what do you have, or are you prepared for what's going to come out, right? What young people are going to disclose, what their reality, their experiences are, and do you recognize where to take that? And sometimes that will be you, because you may be like, this is what we're going to do, or sometimes it will need to be like, actually we can't, this isn't for us, but we could partner with, or this will be the pathway of support. What I would say though is that ultimately young people want to stay in one space and work through those trusted relationships. So whatever you need to do to make sure you can maintain those and make sure that support is coming to them instead of expecting them to go and jump across multiple people and multiple times is, I suppose, the most important part of doing this work.
If it's all right for me to jump in there, I feel like something that comes to mind is the importance of recognizing, I think that that we touched on like the intersectionality, right? Of like how like we're a community organization, obviously working with like different services, whether that's school, like mainstream schools, alternative provisions, social workers, statutory care, like like having an understanding and really looking into like how we are part of like the wider network around that child or that young person or that situation. And it can be I feel like essentially what I'm trying to say is, you know, like harm young people may bring, we've noticed that young people may bring certain like situations, circumstances, disclosures to us due to the nature of the relationships we have with them, and they might not be able to bring that to a school setting, or they may be able, or like the social worker or different professionals may see different sides of the harm or the situation that's going on. So the importance of like multi-agency working, really like being curious of like what of our blind spots, and that we only have like one side of the picture. It makes me think of a young person where, you know, they're like under 18, they're in a really techie, like challenging relationship where they're experiencing harm with a young person that has like high level of SEN needs. She's diabetic, and so like until we were able to like do some multi-agency working and get in touch with like the family social worker, we were able to understand like the complexities of like them being diabetic and filling in the different sides of the of building the picture. And I think that makes me think about like how these behavior, how these signs and risks and harm show up is can really be insightful, but also really subtle, that it could like be right in front of your nose and you can miss it. I think the World Cup and the Euros, there was a campaign about you know, domestic violence goes up when England loses a game. What does that look like for people that English is their second language? You know, that we specifically work with, like Kate said, we see a high percentage of like Black, brown, heritage young people. What does that look like for other groups within our community, whether that's due to like their faith or their gender, or the ones that we're not accessing, you know? And I guess the last thing in closing is the support for like our staff internally. And I guess this is like really heavyweight, quite heavyweight work. And we try our best to like really center staff well-being. So a lot of our frontline staff, specifically our IDVAs, we have alongside the organization MAC UK that we get clinical supervisions once a month, which is like embedded and like stitched into their work plans, because we really recognize that we all come with like our lived experience. Some may be witnessed, some may have experienced some of that stuff. So we have to like really think and embed like hands-on support with like these challenging issues.
Thank you. I've actually got another question, unless somebody else wants to jump in. In fact, I've got two. Can you just, Ricardo, would you mind just kind of explaining how clinical supervision works? Because I know there's some organizations out there that will be already using it, and then others might have heard of it, but just how that kind of works in a really practical sense. And then also just picking up on some of the kind of early intervention stuff that Katie was talking about. And I suspect that, some of the stuff like around misogyny, for example, might be coming up in like music studio sessions and stuff. So what's the really like some of the kind of practical ways that you're kind of dealing with that?
Yeah, in regards to clinical supervision, so we have an agreement and a relationship with MAC UK, where we have access to some of their supervisors. And essentially it's an opportunity to like, dump things that are challenging. It's an opportunity to have someone a little bit removed or external that can support with whether that's like professional capabilities, unsure like about like a young person that you're working with, or a dilemma or a theme that you're working with. And that's kind of set up like once a month. I think it essentially comes from like that formal like professional kind of like healthcare professionals, and I think it was kind of adopted from like more of that clinical kind of like psychology work where a clinician would have a supervisor that kind of guides one that has like a little bit more experienced. It's obviously it's confidential. It's like it's non-judgmental, and it's an opportunity to like improve like your support, improve your kind of practice, and just having a space to like reflect, discuss challenges, think about different skills, think about growth, accountability. I think in relation to this, like the support for our staff is where it kind of like really came from. Your second question was on,
I suppose like I was calling it in the early intervention stuff, but just thinking about like we talk a lot in these types of sessions about lyric writing, and when, for example, misogynistic lyrics might come up in a studio session, and how does that, like, what's the kind of practical ways that might be kind of dialogued, I guess?
I think 3 examples would be, I think context is always like key to it. I think when something comes up which needs to be challenged, if that's specifically coming from like a young male, so many opportunities and so many times over my career where we've like had to like interject and just like use that rhyme or that bar or that lyric or someone else that's like famous in the mainstream, really like dissect and unpack what's going on here, challenge it, look at it, reframe it, bring the context to it, bring the light to it. Most recently, we've been doing some work around our male peer leaders. So they've joined some of the Brook training that we were on around misogyny. So like our role in keeping them in the loop with and the progression of the organization, but also upskilling them and the space that they're working in. What was one of my second things? Please chip in if you can, Katie.
Does this work? Oh yeah, great.
Yeah.
I think so being able to respond in the moment is a really important part of it. But as we mentioned before, like what are we doing to get a little bit more intentional about it as well, outside of just responding in that moment? And so we're starting to co-design with our peer leaders and young people some intentional workshops and spaces where we're going to be, doing that work. a bit more upfront and a bit more openly and a bit more honestly. I think that we've been a bit fearful of bringing that specifically actually to young men because of what it takes to build these relationships with young men who often we are the only like professionals that they engage with, right? And they're coming out of choice because they feel so, they have been so harmed by other systems and spaces. So they could be missing young people, they could be in contact with the criminal justice system, they could have been excluded from education. So we often feel quite I suppose like, yeah, careful how we're treading to create a space that still feels safe for them. But actually, we've really had to pull back and challenge ourselves to go, yes, okay, we've got this place of safety, we've built these trusted relationships, but what is this work that needs to happen to make sure we are really supporting them and understanding their own behaviours, breaking cycles and patterns? Something that I love to see though on a really positive note is how getting intentional about it, how open they are to it, how and actually, and this is a real example of how we have to get in the way of this work ourselves, how open they are to it, but also already how we're seeing them supporting and being able to share that information with their peers and playing roles in calling out when things aren't right and behaviours in their peers. And yeah, I think there's a lesson for us which I wish we'd be more intentional about some of this.
And encouraging, using like off the back of that, like when there is the opportunities to learn, work with them, explore a certain topic, encouraging them to take it on to like what Katie said about like our podcast, One Mic Real Talk, or giving them a brief to address a song. Here's a theme or a topic that you can like take that learning, that conversations, or this is how you can change that rhyme. It's really, really interesting to see it in real time. And I guess, sorry to like flip it on a negative side, I think you kind of mentioned this already, Katie, but the complexities of working with an individual, specifically a young male that has witnessed like really difficult like domestic violence at the household, where if it is like a female in the household that's experienced something, and then them becoming perpetrators. So this balance of like victim, perpetrator, level of care, support, and holding like really clear boundaries of like of how those both cross over. So it's like been really, really interesting, but also challenging and quite difficult at times, to hold kind of like those two things at once.
I think again the biggest lesson there is, and again we've seen a massive gap, which is why we're doing it more, and we've decided we're going to get brilliant at it. Is that if a young person does perpetrate harm or causes harm, a young male, for example, and it reaches the point of contact with the criminal justice system, then often they're perhaps signposted, so they'll be charged with something or being held accountable in that way, but then they'll be signposted perhaps to a perpetrator program which often they don't engage with, don't learn anything from. The relationship is being broken with the trusted youth workers or community space, and they're lost. And actually, what is that work in the long term? How is that solving or supporting or preventing? And so we've been doing a lot about how we try and obviously go through a process. There has to be accountability, etc. But how do we hold on to that relationship and manage that and make sure that we can support beyond just that moment and that tipping point? So yeah, this is the gap in our system, which is we can't see people doing that work.